Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk About That, the Family Life podcast of Peace Lutheran Ministries. I'm Blake Brockman, the Director of Youth and Family Ministries, and for this episode, I'm flying solo. Things are a little chaotic here at Peace with the building expansion wrapping up, being dedicated, things going on, so I'm flying solo today, and today we're starting a new series in Let's Talk About That on habits. So today we are just going to give a brief kind of introduction about habits, talk about what habits are, how we form them, things like that. And then in the next 3 episodes, we're going to talk about forming faith-filled habits, going to church, reading our Bible, prayer, etc. So we hope that you will continue to tune in for Let's Talk About That as we move forward, talking about habits. Habits are something that we all form. Habits are things that we all have, and habits are things we do subconsciously. They're part of our routine. Some habits that I have is like watching football every Sunday. Doesn't matter if it's the Packers or not. I watch football on Sundays. That is a habit of mine, something I've done every Sunday during football season for probably my entire life. But other habits could be something as simple as we'll reference a couple times, brushing your teeth, having breakfast, doing things maybe at certain times of the day or in certain seasons of life. Some fun facts on habits is it on average, it takes 66 days to form a new habit. A lot of people have said like maybe it takes 30 days to learn a new habit. Other people think it could be shorter than that. Other people think it could be longer, and it very well could be. It could just take one time to form a habit. It could take many, many times to form a habit. Another fun fact is that, it's not necessarily fun, but another fact about habits is that it is incredibly difficult to know how long it takes to break a habit. That 66 days to form a habit is kind of the median, the mean, the average amount of time it takes to form a habit, but the amount of time it takes to break a habit is really hard to track because, again, for some people, it doesn't take as long. For other people, it could take years. We could struggle constantly with breaking a habit. And another fun fact that I thought I would put in here is that Jesus had habits. As we talk about habits, especially faith-filled ones, it's important to know that the creator of all things, God himself in the flesh, Jesus Christ, had habits. After a long day or sometimes in the early morning, we see in the Bible that Jesus would go and spend time alone with God the Father in prayer. And that is a great habit to form. We'll get into those kind of biblical, godly habits moving forward in our series. But today I want to talk about how habits are formed, good versus bad habits, and things like that. So the first thing is, how are habits formed? I had to do a little research on how habits are formed. And habits are, from my research, and maybe you already know this, but habits are really all about brain chemistry. They're all about what's going on inside of our brains. And so we do something so often that our brain instinctively remembers it. That is how habits are formed, right? It's like riding a bike. You get on a bike and you learn how to pedal, then you learn how to steer or learn how to balance yourself on the bike. And it takes time to build that up again for some people. Other people, maybe not so much. But a habit is when we do something so often that our brain instinctively remembers how to do it. Again, with riding a bike, there are a lot of people who use the phrase, it's like riding a bike, when talking about something that they're doing maybe for the first time again, or doing something that they haven't done in a long time. Other reasons on how habits are formed is our brain instinctively remembers the things that it's doing because pathways are literally being created in our brain for the different habits that we're making, right? And when we use those pathways constantly, it becomes something that we need to do. So our brain, let's say that you wake up in the morning and the first thing that you do in the morning is brush your teeth. And so you brush your teeth, and that is the first thing you do every single morning. Your brain has a pathway where you wake up and the first thing it's going to want to do is brush your teeth. And when we do those things constantly, it becomes, again, something that we need to do. We'll come back to this. It's the need, a little phraseology here. The need for doing a habit is what's called a craving. And that's why it can become really hard to drop a habit. Again, we'll come back to that. But the pathways in our brains are created because of chemicals that are either called endorphins or dopamine, if you've heard of those two. So endorphins are chemicals that relieve pain and stress. So those are chemicals that are released when we need to relieve some pain. Maybe we get hurt. Maybe we're going through some stress, like adrenaline is kind of like an endorphin in our body. And dopamine is another, what's called a happy chemical. Dopamine is released when we are when we're happy, when we receive something pleasurable, it makes us happy, etc. And those two chemicals are good. They're needed. God created them for us. However, those chemicals can be dangerous in the wrong amounts, and they can make the pathways real deep, kind of like not physically deep trenches, but it can make it so hard to break those pathways and break habits, because those pathways are created with those chemicals. And scientists say that those chemicals of endorphins and dopamine are a lot like opioids. If you know what opioids are essentially drugs, marijuana, different things like that are considered, I guess, opioids. And that is why addictions can be so difficult to break. And we're going to talk more about breaking addictions and breaking most habits later on in this episode. But habits are formed in this way. This is how science would say habits are formed. It's formed by a cue, a behavior, and a reward. So a cue is a triggering event. So let's use some examples here. Let's say you're hungry or you're thirsty, right? That's your cue. You are hungry. Or maybe you're sad. You're feeling an emotion. Or maybe it's an event in your life. Maybe it's your alarm clock going off in the morning. That is a triggering event that tells you you need to do something, right? And so the behavior is how we respond to that event, to that cue. And so let's say we're hungry or thirsty. We feel that cue, we have that triggering event of being hungry or thirsty, and so we go and we get something to eat or get something to drink, and depending on what that thing is, it makes our body feel the next part. Or let's say that we're sad, right? We do something that either makes us, happy. Maybe it's watch a TV show or watch a movie or be with people or be with friends, or maybe it's being alone. Maybe it's crying. Whatever it may be, there's a behavior that comes from that triggering event. With an alarm clock, there could be multiple behaviors after that. So the alarm clock goes off. That's the cue. The behavior could be hitting the snooze button. It could be ignoring the alarm, or it could be getting up and going about your day. But that's kind of where the habit starts, is the cue, the triggering event. We do something, and then we're rewarded. That's the third part. Cue, behavior, reward. We're rewarded with what happens afterwards. So if we're hungry or thirsty, we feel that cue, we do something about it. We go and we get food, and then we're no longer hungry or thirsty. If we're sad, right, we have that event of being sad, and then we do something about it. Maybe for me, it's watch some of my favorite comedy movies or TV shows. And then the result, the reward, is that I'm no longer sad, right? I'm happy. Or maybe when we talk about an alarm clock, the alarm clock goes off. That's the cue, the triggering event. The behavior is maybe I hit the snooze button, and the reward is I get to sleep in a little more. Or if I get up, I'm now getting up and getting ready for the rest of my day. So when we form habits, it's because of an event, a cue, that triggers a behavior that gives us a reward of some kind. And sometimes, as we'll get into the good and bad habits, sometimes those rewards are not good. Sometimes they're sacrificial. Or sacrificial? No. That's not the word I mean. Sometimes they're superficial. There we go. Sometimes they're very superficial, very base need type of rewards. But now we're going to move into talking about a good habit and a bad habit. So distinguishing between the two might seem really easy at times, and that's good. But there are other times where distinguishing between a good habit and a bad habit can be tricky. It can be a little difficult to think about. And so this is what I like to think about. Hopefully it will be helpful for you, is that habits start, Then they turn into a routine. They become part of our day, our every part, a part of our week, whatever it may be. And then there are kind of two different outcomes. So the habit starts, it becomes part of our routine, and then there's two different outcomes because of that. So let's start with good habits. Give us the good news first, right? So good habits, again, the habit is started, then there's the routine, and then there's a blessing that comes after that. It's helping us and helping others, right? So we start the habit, and then it ends up becoming a blessing to me and to someone else. And that blessing part is what's important, right? So brain chemicals are released. When we do certain things, the reward comes in. Those chemicals are released in our brain. They make us feel good, but sometimes those chemicals are released when we do something sinful. Sometimes those brain chemicals are released when we're doing something we shouldn't do. Or a good habit is something that benefits me in a God-pleasing way, right? So if we all go back to the cue behavior reward, if my breath stinks, right? I brush my teeth in the morning. Hannah likes the fact that I brush my teeth in the morning because my breath doesn't stink, and I then turn that into a habit of brushing my teeth in the morning and at night. It then becomes a routine, and the blessing is healthy teeth for me, but it is also a blessing for Hannah because I have nice smelling breath, right? That's a very basic example. And again, the blessing part I think is huge, right? Especially from a Christian perspective, that blessing is not, again, it's not, a good habit is not just for me. Now, there are certainly good habits that are mostly affect us. Setting good habits of sleep, of eating, of working out, doing those things are good for us, but they also can and should be, and most likely will be, if they're a truly good habit, a blessing to someone else. And that's important to point out because now we're going to talk maybe a little bit longer about bad habits. Bad habits, again, start again with that habit, and then they move to the routine. But then instead of it being a blessing, bad habits lead from a routine to an addiction. They go from being just something that we do every day to being something that we can't live without in a negative way. It might make us feel good in the moment, but it leaves us feeling empty and hurt. Maybe it hurts someone else in the long run. Addiction is really the opposite of blessing in this sense, right? And addiction is only serving us. It's only serving what me, myself, and I want. And some bad habits are certainly blessings to someone else, but they're really a detriment to something in our lives, a bad habit is. And it may seem like a benefit in the moment, but it really isn't, right? So addictions often leave us feeling empty or hurting. You've heard of addictions of like alcohol or drugs, right? And we know that those are bad habits. Those are bad addictions. But there are also bad habits in terms of like things that we don't consider a bad habit necessarily. Those would be things like, let's say we have a habit of doing like playing sports on the weekends, going away and having sports tournaments on the weekends. We wouldn't think of that as a bad habit. I did that a lot in growing up as a kid. But if that is going to prevent us from maybe coming to worship or watching worship online, is that really a good habit? If it's only fulfilling my needs of being an athlete or my family's needs of having an athlete or giving us something to do, but it's taking us away from something else that's even better than sports, which in this case is God, is that really a good habit? I'm not going to speak for all of you and say that you all have a deep, dark, bad habit, right? But we all do have bad habits. Some people would say like biting your fingernails is a bad habit. Some people, when I was growing up, I had the bad habit of not thinking before I spoke. And again, bad habits are really, really hard to break. Breaking a bad habit actually gets harder and harder as we keep holding on to them, as we keep doing them. Because remember addiction, right? And remember the brain chemicals that we've talked about at the beginning of this episode is brain chemicals are in, like they're always there, but they're released in these very specific moments. And when they're released, they make us feel happy, even if it's something we shouldn't be doing, right? That's why drug addiction is so difficult for people to maybe escape from, because when you're doing it, it doesn't feel like it's a bad thing. It only feels like a bad thing afterwards. But guess what? Those chemicals have now left your brain, and that's when you start to feel like, oh, I probably shouldn't have done that. But guess what's already happened in your brain? Those pathways in your brain, those little highways that the chemicals travel down, have already been formed or have already been rewritten on. And they keep getting rewritten on in the same place. And it's like, if you've been to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, or if you've heard of that, there's the walkway that the soldiers always walk at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and it's worn its path through. Maybe you've seen that when you just walk along the same path constantly. Is it wears a path in your brain, and when that happens with these bad habits, it becomes increasingly difficult to escape from them, because we want more of that reward chemical, of those endorphins and dopamine type chemicals, because they make us feel good in that moment. And our brain really struggles to differentiate between releasing that in a sinful moment or releasing that in a good, God-pleasing way. And depending on what that habit, that bad habit is, chemicals may be released at different amounts. And so when we do things like drugs, like there's already the chemicals from the drugs that are making that happen, but then there's also our brain chemicals, and it's just an overwhelming chemical, cesspool disaster going on in our brains that is really hard for people to manage and control. And so, breaking bad habits is already hard, but it continues to get harder the longer that we hold on to them, the longer that we let it be an addiction, the longer that we keep it to ourselves, the longer we don't share it with God or share it with others, the more likely it is to continue to be a bad habit and continue to get in the way of our lives. It's actually easier to break a good habit than a bad one. And the reason for that is in order to truly break a habit, scientists say you have to introduce a new habit. That's why things like cutting things out cold turkey can really certainly can work. Like when I was in college, I had the habit of I drank soda at, I didn't eat breakfast at the time, but I drank soda at lunch and dinner. I always had a Mountain Dew, and then occasionally maybe a chocolate milk or some water, but I always had a soda. And then I decided hey, I started finding myself needing to have Mountain Dew in my body in order to feel awake and feel attentive and all that. And I was like, hey, that's not okay. And so I started drinking more chocolate milk instead of soda. And then I started working at Camp Luther. And in order, you can't have chocolate milk in the middle of the woods because it'll go bad. And so instead of drinking or having a soda in my backpack, I would have an Arnold Palmer iced tea because there's no caffeine and it does have, there's no carbonation, but it is sweet. And so I'd have that in my backpack. And so when I felt the need for something sweet, something a little sugary, I would have an Arnold Palmer. And I thankfully have been soda-free for, probably 4 years now, right? But if I would have just tried to cut soda out cold turkey, that would have been very difficult. And maybe you've experienced that in your own life where you have tried to cut a bad habit out of your life and it's been nearly impossible. Know that you're not alone in that, but the reason it's so hard, again, is because when we try to cut something out cold turkey, we're so fixated on getting rid of this bad habit, making sure that we don't do it, that we forget that we need to add something to our lives to fill that place, to take that place of that bad habit. But we don't have that problem with good habits. We usually replace the good habits with bad ones. Here's a general example that might hit home for you, but a general example that we've kind of seen as the church, and that is over COVID, over the coronavirus, this pandemic period, especially early on in the shutdown, people were not here in the building for worship. We were at home. Some people watched online. Lots of people did that. But then eventually that wears off and you start doing new things. The world started opening up again. And it was easier to say no to church and say yes to other things. And again, those things might not be inherently bad, but they became a bad habit because they took us away from the best habit of spending time with God. And it's easy. We don't even think about it most of the time. And so when we talk about replacing bad habits, I encourage you to replace bad habits with good habits. Find a new cue, behavior, and reward. Find a new trigger to a behavior, right? Cues trigger behavior, and then we get a reward. So like brushing my teeth, right? That is a big habit of mine. But if you find yourself falling into a bad habit, into a bad cycle at a certain time of the day, then find something else to do during that time of the day. Find a new cue, a new trigger to start a new behavior and to give yourself a new reward. And then, of course, like that need, again, as the endorphins and things kind of run our brains to a degree, as we have those cravings for the old habits, pray about it. That's the only thing I can kind of say is to pray about it. Remember that God is all powerful. Paul in, I think, 2 Corinthians, either 1st or 2 Corinthians, it's on the screen if you're watching at home. It's the classic passage of his thorn in his flesh. And Paul is experiencing this thorn in the flesh, and he's praying that God take it away. And God tells him, no, like you need to keep this. But something that God tells Paul is, my power is made perfect in your weakness. And that's something that we can be reminded of when we are struggling with bad habits, is that even when we're struggling, God is still strong. And he is still the one that's walking alongside us, is never forsaking us, is always trying to help us push forward and find these good habits that we're going to talk about in the next 3 episodes of coming to worship, reading our Bible, and praying. We're going to talk about that in the personal sense, but we're also going to talk about that for our families. But thank you so much for watching. Next time we are going to dig into forming the habit of reading our Bible. We hope that you found value in this week's episode of Let's Talk About That. You can check out the discussion questions on our website, peaceantigo.org/family. I think is how you get to Family Ministries. There's a link in the description on YouTube. If you're already on our website listening, you can find the discussion questions there. But next time I will have a guest, and I'll talk with you then. God's blessings on your week. Bye-bye.